Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short session for 30 minutes. Tim Baker's my name, and welcome wherever you are. We've got people all over the place, including outside Australia, so welcome. And look forward to spending just a brief amount of time with you just to talk about a very important topic around teamwork. And that's ultimately the fact that all teams have got stakeholders. And no team, of course, is an island on its own. And the quality of stakeholder management is often a very strong determinant as to how the team's actually performing. So I want to talk about that today as one facet of what a high-performing team is. And that comes from my book, Winning Teams, the 8 Characteristics of High-Performing Teams. So let me share my screen and then we can launch into the topic. Okay, so just a little bit about me. If those of you who don't know who I am, I'm an author. I've written 12 books. Of course, one of those books is Winning Teams, which I'm going to talk about today, but more particularly about stakeholder management. And I'm also a keynote speaker, and I perform workshops, executive coach, and in my spare time, I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane. Now, I just should warn you, there's a little bit of maintenance going on in the office today, certainly not in the office, but outside. So if you hear any noise and banging, I'm sorry about that, but there's not much I can do. So we just battle through, and we're only 30 minutes. So with a bit of luck, we'll get through it unscathed. Now, I'll be sending you a copy of the slides and the recording at the end of this presentation so that you can sort of review that and have a look at the slides and maybe even look at the recording. So you'll receive that at the end of the presentation. Now, I'll just point out that the book Winning Teams has received lots of wonderful endorsements from a range of people, including in the sporting world, and which is wonderful because a lot of the book is about anecdotes from the sporting world, and particularly the All Blacks. The All Blacks have an 83% success rate in terms of winning, and that's, I think, the largest in the world. So they are certainly an exemplar of a high-performing team away from the world of sport, and in the world of sport, I should say. And I think a lot of those characteristics are very applicable for the world of business. And of course, stakeholder management is one of those. So yes, I received an endorsement from Nick Farr-Jones, who was the former Wallaby captain and great, who had a nice thing to say about my book. So I got some great testimonials, and that was always wonderful and I'll have a special offer for you at the end of today's session. Now, in the book, I talk about the 8 characteristics of high-performing teams. Now, you can see on the right-hand side, around the outside, these are the 8 characteristics. Now, the 8 characteristics are all important. And today, of course, we're going to look at managing stakeholders. And each of these sessions, I have a different topic that I look at in relation to these 8 characteristics. So show me any high-performing team anywhere, regardless of whether it's on the sporting field or in business or wherever, and I'll show you a team that is able to manage their stakeholders very, very effectively. And the reason is, of course, that you really can't be successful unless you're dealing effectively with those that you deal with, both inside the organization and outside the organization. So I'll define what I mean by stakeholders very shortly. So we're going to concentrate on just one element today. Now, the good news about the model, I might say, is it can seem overwhelming, and you can say, well, I understand all these 8 characteristics are important, building trust and being agile and creating purpose and so on. But where do I start? And I often say to people, just start with one characteristic. And, you know, even today, if you start with managing stakeholders as a characteristic, you're going to be in a much better position. And the good news is, if you work on your stakeholder management, then it's going to permeate into other areas around the model. So my suggestion is just work on one area. Don't try and deal with 8 at once, because it's just too much and we're just too busy in our busy world. So concentrate on one And the good news is if you concentrate on one, it's likely to impact positively on the others, or at least a few of the others. Okay, now one of the typical objections that I get when I'm working with teams around stakeholder management is that people in teams often have a perception that you as the team leader is you're the person that looks after stakeholder management. Because you're the leader of the team, it's your job to do that. But in actual fact, there are many of your team members have got excellent working relationships with some of your stakeholders. So obviously they're in a great position to build a better working relationship up with that stakeholder than you would, even though you may be the team leader. So I would argue that stakeholder management is actually a responsibility of the total team. And so today I'm going to share with you an exercise that can help you to make sure that your team members are accountable for stakeholder management, that it's not just your responsibility. Because obviously, if it's your responsibility, you're only one member of the team, albeit an important member. So the big objection I get is, how do I get my team members to take ownership of stakeholder management? So I'm going to talk about that today, of course. So there's three things that I'm going to cover pretty much in our short session. I'm going to look at a 3-position model, which I'll share with you, which is really a mindset that we need when we're dealing with anyone, whether they're stakeholders, customers, or anyone, if we're trying to get a good working relationship happening. I'm going to talk about, who are your 5 top stakeholders? Have you worked those out? Do you know? Could you confidently list those? For example, if I ask you now, not that I will directly, but could you actually list those? And I'm going to share with you a unique model that I use in my book, the spur model, which is a great exercise to work with your stakeholder, basically your team, to develop a priority around stakeholders. And as I said earlier, to give accountability to your team for stakeholder management. So that's what we're covering. And then I'll have a special offer for you at the end of this session. Okay, so what are stakeholders? So just let's be clear about this before we go any further. And this is a definition from the Association of Project Management that basically says that systemic identification, analysis, planning, and implementation of action to engage with stakeholders. So stakeholder management is not just a case of dealing with people on a need-to-know basis. It's really about taking a more strategic view of that. And I think this is very important. I mean, if you listed all your stakeholders down, I think you'd find that you'd surprise yourself that there are so many. Now, the issue, and we use the Pareto principle here, that 20% of your stakeholders will take up, no doubt, 80% of your time, and 80% of your stakeholders will probably take up 20% of your time. So I would suggest that the place to start, of course, is to work with your top 5 stakeholders. And that's what I want to share with you, an exercise that'll help you do that. Now, I'm not suggesting we should neglect the other stakeholders, of course not. We should deal with all stakeholders in a respectful way. But at the end of the day, your success as a team is going to depend on your relationship with a few stakeholders. And it'd be interesting for you to ask your team, for example, who they would rate as their 5 top stakeholders. And would they be on the same page as you in that regard, if indeed they could even mention them at all? So let's have a look at that and how we might go about that in a little bit more detail. So who are your top 5 stakeholders? Have you worked that out? Now, you might say to me, well, what do you mean by top 5 stakeholders? Because, are we talking about the amount of power they have over the team? Are we talking about, for example, a stake in your team's success? Are we talking about how much time you spend with stakeholders? That they're all interesting questions, and I'm going to give you a little formula that will help you with that to determine how you might identify those top 5 stakeholders. Now, just imagine this: if you and your team could agree on your top 5 stakeholders based on a criteria I'll give you shortly, that in itself is a huge step in the right direction, because what that will probably mean is that, well, first of all, your team's on the same page as you are. But secondly, it'll probably mean that you can exert a little bit more effort, if you like, to make sure that those 5 stakeholders are critically important. Now, I would suggest that on your list of top 5 stakeholders, one of them would be your boss. Because let's face it, without your boss's approval, without your boss's cooperation, it's probably likely that you're not going to get much done in your team. So I would imagine in the top 5 stakeholders, one of those would be your boss. And you can fill in the blanks on the other 4, but I would suggest that would be certainly one straight off the bat that would be a top stakeholder. Now, of course, stakeholders can be internal and external to the organization, and that has to be considered as well. And sometimes during COVID, when we're working remotely and we're in these hybrid working arrangements, stakeholder management can go by the wayside. So I think this is a very important topic. And I think that the hybrid working world that we're dealing with now is actually going to be a thing of the future. I don't believe we're going to go back to the old way of being in the office all the time. I think there's going to be some sort of an arrangement where people, now not everyone, of course, can work from home, but in the situation where people can, who are office-based, I believe that will be a thing of the future, and it makes good sense for lots of reasons. So let's look a little further into this. Now, this is the spur model that I talked about at the beginning. Now, what I would suggest you do is this. I would suggest that you, next time you meet with your team, you need to allocate probably about 30 minutes for this exercise. I think you can do quite a lot in 30 minutes if you do this exercise as I suggest. But you get your team together. Now you can get them together either online or face-to-face or a combination of both, whichever, it doesn't really matter. But obviously we still have team meetings, and whenever you have your team meeting, that would be the ideal time to do this exercise. And I think what you need to do at this stage is you ask your team members, and try not to do too much talking in this, because I think the idea is to try and get your team members to do the heavy lifting. But ask your team members to identify who the stakeholders are that your team, their team, our team actually deals with on a regular basis. And if you've got a whiteboard there, sometimes it's a great idea to draw a circle in the middle, put your team there, and then have sort of a series of spokes coming out, and just write down the stakeholders that that your team suggests. Now, you'll be surprised at this exercise to start with. It'll probably start off slowly because people really aren't attuned to this. They're probably not thinking about it. But you'll find that after a few minutes, people start to mention all sorts of people and all sorts of stakeholders that perhaps weren't considered at the outset. Now, a stakeholder could be defined as a department or another team or an individual, right? So anything goes there. You write all of these things down. So you basically fill up the whole board, if you're working on a whiteboard, with your what we call a stakeholder map. And you use your team to be, to guide that. So take your time with this. It's important that you get as many stakeholders on there as possible. Now, just by doing that exercise for a start, you've identified a series of stakeholders that perhaps were out of sight and out of mind. So you've already done something really useful there just by doing that. Now, obviously, you'll end up with a lot of stakeholders. And the question then to ask people is, you then can go through each stakeholder and you ask the team to rate them. And what you're trying to do is to rate them on the criteria that I've got here. So, for example, you'll go around, you look at your stakeholders, and you'll perhaps ask the first question. And the first question is around stake, which is the stakeholders' financial, emotional, reputational stake in the team's success. So of the stakeholders that you've listed there, how many of them are extremely dependent on your team for success? Because the reciprocal is probably true. You're probably depending very much on their success as well. So identify those and give it a rating out of 5. 5 means extremely, 4 is reasonably, 3 is somewhat, 2 is, perhaps, and 1 is not terribly, they don't have a great vested interest in your team's success. So you get your team to do this, and the whole idea is to get them engaged in this exercise. So it's very much a collaborative exercise. Then you ask the team into the next criteria, which is power. So the influence the stakeholder has over the success or failure of the team's ability to achieve its purpose. Now, you might say, surely I've asked that before with a stakeholder, with the stake, not necessarily, because this is power. Now we're talking about their ability to influence your team's success, right? That's what we want to know. Now, obviously your boss would rate a 5. Your boss would probably rate a 5 for stake as well, because clearly they're going to have enormous influence over the success of your team. And, they can, agree or disagree on various proposals and all the rest of it. So we're going to rate our stakeholders on their influence or power over the team. Now, the third criteria we're going to look at is the importance, that is your team's reliance on the stakeholder for resources. Now, if you're hugely dependent on a stakeholder for resources, whether that be information or whether it be, physical resources, whatever it might be, you can define resources however you choose. Then if you've got if your team is enormously reliant on it, you'll probably rate that a 5 or a 4. So you ask the team to consider which of these stakeholders do we rely on for our resources. So it just is a slightly different focus on the first 2. Now, the fourth criteria is really around regularity, and that is you ask them in terms of how regular is our contact with the stakeholders. Now, some stakeholders, it could be a daily contact, whereas with others, at the other extreme, it could be once a year, like a regulatory body or whatever. So how often do you deal with those stakeholders? Now, the more often you deal with those stakeholders, the higher the rating would be. Why? Well, for the simple reason that obviously the greater the interaction you have with that stakeholder, the more likely, or perhaps I should say, the more important the working relationship is, because obviously if something happens or there's been a misunderstanding or a lack of communication, then it's obviously going to impact significantly because of the regularity of contact. So again, I'll rate my stakeholders out of 5. So now what I've done is I've given 4 scores. And now it's simply a case of being able to tally up the scores and work out which of the stakeholders on your map have the highest rating. Now, based on this criteria, of course, the highest rating would be a 20 because you've put 4 scores together. So obviously, if you've got any 20s on your list, then clearly they're going to be in the top 5. And then you work your way through until you can come up with your top 5 stakeholders. So the objective of the exercise is ultimately to rate your stakeholders in terms of stake, power, importance, and regularity, and to come up with a list of the top 5 stakeholders that everybody in your team can agree with. So it's not just you and the team agree with that decision. And that's why it's very important. This is why this exercise is enormously powerful, because you are now conveying the accountability for stakeholder management back to your teams. All right, so now once I've got the 5 top stakeholders, and you might say, oh, well, what happens if we've got, a tie on the, you can have 6 if you want, you can have 4. I'm picking 5 because it's a nice manageable number. But what we're doing here is we're creating a list of priorities. Now, as I said earlier, that doesn't mean we forget about the other stakeholders, because if we forget, all the stakeholders are important, of course. But what we've actually done is we've given ourselves a bit of a framework to work with. And we've said that we've got these top 5 stakeholders, and we will work with those top 5 stakeholders to improve the working relationship we have with them. So once you've identified that, the next step you can do with your team is to ask them, what can we do not what they can do. What can we do that can actually improve the quality of our working relationship with that stakeholder? Because often you hear, complaining and whinging and, when this stakeholder does this, or when they make contact with us, or I sent an email to them 2 weeks ago and I didn't get anything back. All of that may well be true, but what the focus here is on what we as a team can do to improve our working relationships with those 5 stakeholders. All right. Now, a lot of those things are very practical. It might be that you might, that you as a team leader might attend one of their team meetings, or you might actually, sit down and have a coffee with the leader of that team and clarify a few key points where things didn't go well previously. Whatever it might be, there are lots of things that can be done. So I think it'd be easy to underestimate the power of this stakeholder mapping exercise, but I think you'll find it extremely useful. And you'll find that probably within 30 minutes, you've achieved an enormous amount. You have sensitized your team to the importance and value of your stakeholders, 1. Secondly, you've identified who your top 5 stakeholders are. 2. 3, you've all agreed on those 5 stakeholders because you've all collectively put a result in. And I guess the final objective there is that we've developed a few strategies around how we can actually improve the quality of our stakeholder engagement, which is, of course, extremely important. And what we've done is we've taken the responsibility for doing that. It's not just a case that, when they do this, we'll do that. This is what we're going to do. You're taking a sense of accountability into, taking that on board to deal with these stakeholders moving forward. Okay, so that's the exercise there. And I'll just go through a little process for you on just a mindset shift that would be useful in your team. And this comes from neuro-linguistic programming, which is a bit of a mouthful, say that 3 times. But ultimately, it's a really useful way of looking at your dealings with stakeholders, and indeed anyone that you deal with in the communication piece. You'll notice down in the bottom left-hand corner, you've got first position, and then you've got on the right-hand corner, second position, and at the top of the triangle, you've got third position. Now, what that basically means is that you can adopt 3 positions when you're dealing with a stakeholder. So let's look at first position. Now, first position is the worst position to be in. First position is ultimately when you're looking at things through your own eyes and the stakeholder is looking at things through their own eyes. In other words, their perspective is just what I need, where I am. And this is very typical in most stakeholder engagements. Looking at things through both eyes means that if you've got a difference of point of view, then you'll both passionately argue your position. And in other words, you don't listen to the other person. So if you see 2 people, for example, having an argument, you could easily say, according to this model, that they're in first position. They're both arguing with each other, passionately defending their position. They're not listening to the other person and so forth. Now, you don't want to be in that position because obviously, whilst you might have a very strong view about your perspective, it's not helpful. It's not helpful. What you want to do is to get into second position. Now, second position is where you see things through their eyes. Now, that doesn't mean you've dropped the ball on your own view. You may still have a view that's counter to the view of the other person, but you've taken the time and the energy to understand their perspective. So this means you've got to spend time listening, asking questions, identifying their perspective, because obviously if you understand their perspective, you're in a much better position to be able to negotiate something between your position and their position. So second position is a good position to be in, but a far better position to be in is what we might call third position, or the helicopter view. That's where not only do you have a point of view, first position, not only do you understand the other person's point of view, second position, but you also have a view. In other words, you can put things into context and understand how things work. We could call this the political view. You have an overview. You understand, you know, it might be like the best analogy I can give is it's like being in a helicopter looking down at a forest. You'll notice there are lots and lots of green, you know, there's lots of greenery, but you can't actually make out the individual trees. First position's when you've got your head buried up against a tree and you can't see anything else. Second position is where you've stepped back in the forest and you've noticed another tree and another tree and another tree, so you can actually see other people's positions. And third position is where you've got into that helicopter view, where you can see an overview and an understanding of how things work and why stakeholders may have the perspective that they have. So that's just something to think about, because I think, you know, it's all very well identifying your top 5 stakeholders, but quite frankly, if you're not adopting the right point of view as to how you might deal with them, then if you, for example, are only in first position and it's got to be my way or the highway, then obviously you're not going to get very far, even though you may well be convinced of your view and be highly critical of the other person's point of view. You want to get yourself at least into second position and hopefully even into third position. So you might want to talk about that with your team members as well, because pointing the finger of blame is actually not helpful in the long run. What you've got to try and do is resolve it so that you're all on the same page. Now, those of you, I know I'm starting to develop a loyal following now, and next Friday and every Friday, I have one of these, you know, short, sharp sessions. And next Friday, I have one from 10 to 10:30. And this one's going to look at applying a team values charter to develop trust. It's a popular topic. I've done this one before, but I know that others have found it very useful. So we'll look at the team values charter. And it's another very powerful exercise, but it's about galvanizing your team and building trust. So don't miss that. And when I send you the slides, you'll also get you'll get a link, and you just click on the link as you did for today, and in you go, and you'll be there. So please join me next Friday. And finally, I just wanted to let you know I've got a few books of winning teams available in my office, and I'm more than happy to give you a special discount today. Normally, if you go to Amazon and you look at postage and payment, you'll be paying about $35, but my price today is only $25, and that's inclusive of postage. And I will sign the book for you personally and send it out to you. So if you're interested in getting a copy, then all you've got to do is send me an email by the close of business today, and I will arrange payment with you and get the book out to you ASAP. And it obviously talks about what we talked about today, but lots and lots of other very practical things that you can do to make sure that your team is a high-performing team. So I'll just finish up there. So the next thing you'll hear from me, you'll get an email from me, and in that email will be a copy of the slides and the recording, and of course a link for next week's webinar. So thanks everybody. Enjoyed working with you today, and have a wonderful day. Have a wonderful weekend. I guess my key point is stay positive and bring your very best self to work, whether it's virtual or otherwise. Thanks everyone, all the best, and catch you next week. Thank you and goodbye.